Hey everyone, so for today's lecture we're going to be looking at the causes of the Great Depression. The Great Depression ends really about 50 plus years of massive economic growth in the United States. There had been some downturns here and there, but really overall the economy in the United States had been growing for 50 years since the 1880s through the 1920s at really incredible pace. And the United States becomes the largest economy in the world at this point, but with the crash of the stock market in 1929, the 1930s are an era of depression, an era of economic downturn, of economic hardship, and of unemployment for the country. And it really isn't until the Second World War that the United States will get out of the Great Depression. So during the 1920s, this is really an era of a lot of money going around. We saw that in the lecture on the 1920s, the decadence, the wealth of this era. But the GNP grew by $100 billion by 1929. That's over $1.5 trillion in today's money. Employment shrank to about 3%. So people have jobs, there's money going, things are going really well for the country. One of the things that really contributes to the growth of the economy is that people are really becoming consumers in a large way. You see people buying lots of new products. There's a lot of new products to buy. Consumer durables lead to this economic boom. Americans wanted cars, radios, ovens, washers and dryers, clothes, new things. This is where you really see the growth of capitalism, the growth of marketing. People buying goods is leading the economy. In the 1920s, President Calvin Coolidge described America as this: the business of America is business. What that meant is business in America is important. It's the market economy, it's consumer goods, it's jobs that are really driving the country. So that's what America is all about, is that growth of business, the growth of market, the growth of capitalism. And this is where you really see this great economic growth occurring because of these new consumer goods. You can see that depicted here in the kitchen goods. There's things to buy. There's new ovens, there's new cooking devices, there's new washers and dryers. There's consumer goods really driving the business and the economy of the country. And with this economic growth, credit really begins to be used in mass around the country to be able to fuel this demand to buy things. So you really see the idea of like no money, no problem. Americans begin to buy on credit, causing demand to surge. So banks are willing to lend money so that people can buy things they can't necessarily afford and pay it back. And because of that, you see spending doubled in the 1920s. People are buying beyond their usual means on credit. It is also during the period of the 1920s that the stock market really begins to grow, and the stock market surges as the economy grows. So what you can do is buy stocks in companies. So you own a small percentage of the company. As that company grows, your stock grows, and therefore the value grows. People saw stocks at the time as a sure thing, where the money was essentially free. You could put money into the market and it would continue to grow. You can see that in an example of GE's stock surge from 128 a share to 396 a share in 1 year. So that's a huge amount of growth there. It's growing rapidly. And so people are saying, hey, this is a great way to invest money. It's helping the economy, and I'm going to get a bunch of money. And there's really no risk in this. They don't see the risk inherent in the stock market during this period. However, there are some underlying structural problems in the economy. People are buying on credit, they're investing in stocks, everything seems to be good, but there are problems that are coming. So one of the root causes of the Great Depression is that supply began to exceed demand. What that means is that as people are buying goods, um, they don't want as many in the future. So companies are producing more and more, but people already have a new car, so they don't want to buy the next year's new car. So supply really starts to exceed demand, and that the supply of goods is more than the consumer demand for goods. This decline was inevitable by the late 1920s, and the economy had to contract until supply and demand leveled out. That is, they had to produce less things until demand caught up with it, so people would buy those things. So companies had really grown on the idea that demand would stay the same. So they would continue to supply goods, consumers would continue to buy them, And this meant that oversized and financially strained companies began to exist. Companies boomed in the 1920s in response to the surge in demand. Um, they had peaked, they reached their peak in 1928, and you could see that as construction declined 13% in 1928. So that means that the companies had been producing a lot, construction had been growing greatly, but then by 1928, it's like, oh, people don't want to buy as much stuff. They don't want to buy houses. Not looking for new buildings as much. There's already enough supply, so you see kind of a restriction in the economy, and these companies are going to have to pull back. Another thing that has occurred due to this massive economic growth over the last 50 years is that there was an unequal distribution of wealth. So you remember how the robber barons had gotten so rich, so filthy rich, and there's a huge gap between rich and poor people. The top 1% owned 39% of the wealth. So the top 1% of people in the country owned 39%. So that's over a third. 75% of the money made in the 1920s went to the top 1%. So they're making money growing companies, investing in the stock market, things like this. So you see all this money going to the top 1% of earners. And poor people's wages were stagnant. So this will lead to problems. Some of these problems can really be summed up by looking at the Tinker family. The Tinker family were 9 family members who worked at the Columbian Canning Company in Lubbock, Maine. Each person made an average of $7.36 per week in 1922, but by 1928 that had dropped to $5.78. So their wages have actually dropped significantly over the course of the 20s. So rich people are getting rich, but these people who are working in the factory are actually making less money than they were earlier in the decade. So that means they can't buy as much. That means that there are problems sustaining their lifestyle. So this is really a problem in the economy. Another problem is there's a drop in foreign demand for American goods. So there is economic instability overseas, in particular in Germany. Other places are beginning to see an economic downturn. Germany is seeing a hyperinflation crisis. And you also have to remember the rest of the world is coming out of World War I, so they're not booming like the United States is. So there are problems of demand sending products outside the country. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed in 1930, and this tariff was meant to prevent the Great Depression, but actually ended up leading to more problems of the Depression and increased tariffs on imports from about 40 to 48%. And so what that means is goods coming in the United States are tariffed or taxed really highly. So the idea is to keep the goods that produced in the United States, so grow the economy in the United States, but by keeping foreign companies out. But what happens is exports dropped by 78%. So goods going out of the country actually dropped as a result of this. And this leads to further economic decline. And so while the 1920s were an era of boom for a lot of people in the cities, there was actually an agricultural depression during the 1920s. Farmers struggled during the entire decade. You can see that in the prices of wheat declined by 75% over the decade. So this is one of the main products, one of the main crops they're producing. The price is dropping drastically. 600,000 farmers went bankrupt in the 1920s. And what this means is people in agriculture societies in the country outside the cities could not buy a lot of those consumer products. So they're falling even farther behind people who are in the cities. So what happens is there's a lot of economic instability. With Americans buying goods on credit, Americans were financially stretched and overburdened as a result of buying these goods on credit. So you can see that in the numbers of consumer goods that were bought on credit. So 60% of radios were bought on credit, 75% of furnitures, 75% of cars. At the same time, 80% of Americans had no savings, and personal debt had doubled over the decade. So that is, they're buying all these goods in the idea of paying it back, but they're not saving any money in the meantime. So you can see this really setting up, if there is a downturn, if there is a crisis, what could happen to the economy. So all of these factors would lead up to the collapse of the financial sector. And this occurs in 1929 when the stock market crashes. So the collapse of the stock market is really brought on by the massive growth that you see in the stock market. So it creates a bubble. Everyone wants stock. Companies plowed their profits into the market. So when companies were making profit, they were putting that additional money into the stock market because it's growing. And people assumed that a stock was a sure thing. They thought when they put money into a stock, into a company, that was going to continue to grow, that the economy would continue to grow, and that you would just see a return on your investment. And often people were buying stocks on the margin. What that means is that they were buying stock without paying full price. So stock cost $20, you're only paying 10 of it, in the idea that as that grows, you'll pay the additional money back. And what happens is that leads to more of a bubble. What happens is they cannot repay their loans because the stock prices did not grow with the collapse. So everyone is getting in the practice of the stock market, and this creates an overblown stock market. Bank loans to stockbrokers grew by 92% during 1927 to 29. So the banks are giving money to stockbrokers to invest, money they might not have, other people's money, loaning it out to brokers to invest in the market. And the stock market grew from 27 billion to 87 billion during 1925 to 1929. So a huge growth in that area, but that's really a result of a bubble. So the tipping point of all this was that businesses began to fail as a result of the loss of demand, as a result of being oversupplied. And so these business failures caused people to reassess their stock investments in the late 1920s. So think if you had invested in a company and all of a sudden that company's failing to bring a profit in, the stock's not growing. And you could see that when U.S. steel dropped 90%, so 90% of the value in U.S. steel drops as the demand for steel dies, the company's no longer growing, their stock drops. All of this comes to a culmination on October 29th, 1929, on a date that is now known as Black Tuesday. During this day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped from 381 points to 41 in the day. So you see how much value it loses there. This triggered a panic in selling. So what happens is when these stocks start dropping, people try to sell the stocks they have so they can at least get some money back on their investment. $10 billion disappeared in that day. $125 billion in today's money. By the end of the collapse, over 25 billion was wiped out. $320 billion today. So a massive amount of value in the stock market. The stock market completely crashes, and this really leads to the Great Depression. You can see that depiction here in these two graphs. The black graph on the left shows just the massive decline from the summer of 1929 all the way until October 1929. The market completely crashes. And then you could see the year-end close of the market from 1919 to 1939. You can see throughout the 1920s, the stock market is growing all the way up to 1929, and then it begins to drop until you see its lowest year in 1933 and 1934. What's crazy is the Dow Jones did not close above its 1929 high of 381.17 points until November 23rd, 1954. So it doesn't gain that much market value back until the 1950s. So this is a huge, huge economic collapse. You begin to see things like this occurring. You could see this. This looks like a very nice vehicle for the days and says $100 will buy this car, must have cash, lost all on the stock market. So people had invested all their money in the stock market, and in a short period of time, that money has completely disappeared. So people are willing to sell their automobile on the street for $100 cash just because they don't have anything. They've taken all their money, they don't have any savings, they've invested in the market, and it has now been completely wiped away. So the stock market crash then leads to massive amounts of banks collapsing. Banks had invested about 40% of their money in the stock market. And so what's happened is banks take people's money, take care of it, and they put that money into investments and try to grow that money, or they try to make money for themselves with other people's money. When the stock market falls, they lose all that money. So 10,000 banks went bankrupt. About 50% of banks went bankrupt in the country, and about $140 billion were lost. So people have invested their money in a bank or put their money in a bank. The bank has invested that money in the stock market. Now their money's gone from the bank. And so this causes what's known as run on banks. You can see this depiction here, this picture here of people running the bank trying to get out any money they can before all the money in the banks is gone. This causes massive amounts of banks to go bankrupt. Also, what happens is the Federal Reserve does not get involved. It really drops the ball on this. The Federal Reserve did not intervene and jumpstart banks. So what the Federal Reserve could have done was change interest rates or injected more money into the banking system to try to help out, bail out the banks. This is what happened in the Great Recession, is that the federal government, the Federal Reserve, gave out $700 billion to prevent a Great Depression. That doesn't happen in 1929, 1930. So the money supply contracted. There's less money available. And because of that, demand plummeted. So this really gets the ball rolling. The stock market collapses, the banks collapse. The Federal Reserve does not bail out the banks, does not help out the banks. So demand throughout the country plummets. The government doesn't do anything to help. The government actually makes it worse. So President Herbert Hoover actually thought that the nation could fix itself. Remember, this is a country of laissez-faire, hands-off government. They thought that getting government involved wouldn't fix any of the problems, that the market would fix itself, everything would come about. And the government opposes welfare spending, giving people money so they can afford things. And they also oppose government spending, putting money into the stock market, trying to bail out banks, things like this, to really jumpstart the economy. So they don't do anything to really meet what's happening. So all of this causes a spiral into depression. The banking collapse caused businesses and consumers to fear their own welfare and caused them to cut back on spending. So what that means is businesses aren't spending money, they're not going out and producing stuff. Consumers are not buying anything because either they've lost their job or they've lost a lot of their money. And this causes the depression to only get worse from year to year as demand continues to drop. The worst year of the depression will be in 1933. And then you see the GNP of the country drop by 54% by the mid 30s. And you can see depictions of this. Wanted a decent job. You see people saying like, hey, I'm a decent man. I have a family. I'm a war veteran. I'm trying to get a job. I've just lost everything. So you see this spiral of depression. This really destroys the country in a lot of ways. So the 1930s will really be defined as an era of depression, an era of food lines, an era of free coffee and donuts for the unemployed, massive unemployment throughout the country, massive suffering as a result of all these factors that led to a decades-long depression. And again, it won't be until the Second World War begins in 1941 that the United States really comes out of this depression.